Another advantage of using the mineralized straw is that it acts as a great mulch. Hi, welcome to WeSow, and in today's episode I'm going to give you a little allotment roundup. Normally we tend to give you guys a full tour of the allotment, however we've decided to just give a little roundup as a summary to show you guys how we got on this year. As many of you guys may be aware, we had some quite interesting weather. We had record-breaking heat, very little rain, and we had highs of 40 degrees Celsius. So as you can imagine, that presented some unique challenges. However, what we want to do as far as showing you what happened is to give you guys some insight as far as some allotment winners and losers, some experiments we tried, and also some learnings that we took from this very interesting season. So continue watching and we'll get into how things went. So to begin, the season started off looking as though it had potential to result in some great harvests. We were completely unaware of the possibilities that we would have such a long drought, and at first the warm weather just seemed to be optimum as far as allowing us to get our plants started off and into the soil ready to have some good growth. The interesting thing about the season was that at first we had a little bit of rain, and then when we started to plant things we noticed that the rain just disappeared, and as a result some seeds, should I say, that we had put in the ground, as is the case of the wheat that we tried, the first batch that we sowed on one side, it came up quite nicely when the rain had fallen, but once the rain had stopped it resulted in the other side, which was sown around the same sort of time, not coming up at all. And we didn't realize that this lack of rain was going to be an ongoing thing. And so whilst that's one example of what happened, we found that generally the lack of rain was presenting challenges for us in the impact that it was having on our plants. The wheat was just a very obvious example whereby we ended up with one half of the allotment, or should I say one half of the plot where the wheat was planted, that grew up nicely, which had managed to respond to the first bout of rain, but this other half was really delayed and as a result didn't grow as well. Nonetheless though, the season was good in terms of the sunshine that we got. The main challenge was just that because there wasn't any rain, it meant that the soil was very dry throughout a lot of the periods, and then as the temperature started to climb really high, we noticed that even when I was watering once or even twice a day, I could go back maybe one day after and an area look as though it had never been watered in the first place. And so the result was that some plants tend to do better in these conditions, others not so much. And so now I'm going to just get into some allotment winners. So the good news that we'll begin with are the allotment winners. The first winner we had was the lettuce. The problem we'd always had on our plot was a lot of high slug impact, and so this year we planted all of our lettuce under greenhouse cloche, and so the advantage was that hopefully it would slightly reduce the amount of slugs that would be able to freely move through the bed, but also because the lettuce was under cloche, the watering would result in the soil only being wet during the periods where we watered, as opposed to it being constantly wet in the event of rain. And that's was advantageous, because if there was extra rain at the time, although there wasn't, what that could mean is that slugs would have constant free rein to get in and out of the area. Whereas if it was raining, having things under the cloche meant that the soil didn't stay wet longer than we would have wanted it to, which would reduce the amount of slugs. However, the biggest thing we did for the lettuce was we made use of some diatomaceous earth granules. And the advantage of those was just that these tend to retain their effectiveness even after being wet, because they were calcium treated. So the granules basically irritate the slugs, so the slugs don't like to crawl on it. And so what that meant was that we had the reduction in the slugs crossing into the bed and eating up all of the lettuce. It was very effective, and the calcium treatment meant that, unlike powdered diatomaceous earth, the lettuce would remain, or should I say, the diatomaceous earth granules would keep their effectiveness even after being wet, once they had dried out. So the lettuce grew very well. We had lots of lettuce to eat throughout the season. It was wonderful because we haven't had that in a while. But the other thing we also had to do a lot, because the slugs will still try, was we sprayed our lettuce with garlic water. We would do that daily, especially while the plants were young. And between those two things, we had great harvests for the lettuce. Aside from the lettuce, the other winner that we had was cucumbers. The cucumbers responded well to just the watering we were giving them. They were able to manage with just our watering rather than needing lots and lots of rainwater. Aside from the cucumbers, the beans also did quite well. As per normal, we had some borlotti beans, and we also had red pole beans and some runner beans, and we also grew some butter beans in addition, which was a new thing for this year. And then we also had some navy beans, which are also known as trying to remember the name actually. Navy beans, they're also known as, well, they're the same beans that are used for baked beans, put it this way. And we had quite good success with the beans. No problems there. There was maybe a little bit of a delay in their growth due to the heat initially, but as they got established, they started to do okay. Also, we had the broad beans, which did all right, and the peas did okay as well during the season. I think towards the end things got a bit dry, but nonetheless they did all right. The tomatoes did very well. The good thing was that the lack of rain meant that blight wasn't a problem, which was great. And then aside from the tomatoes, we did well with our callaloo, and also what was really good was our butternut squash, because normally we tend not to have a great time with the butternut squash. So we found that we started them off a bit earlier, and as a result they grew absolutely nuts, and our butternut squashes were significant in number and huge, which was fantastic. Another winner as well, we would say, was the carrots, because what we did was we started to use root trainers to grow the carrots instead of putting them straight in the soil, because the slugs would just eat them up. And in the root trainers they had enough space for the roots to get longer, or should I say what would be the main structure of the carrot to get stronger in this longer type of container. And then we just waited until the structure was formed till it's kind of like a nice orange mini carrot, and then put those in the beds. And in that way we found that we were able to get around the slug problem. So we found that the carrots grew strong and were placed in the beds whilst they were stronger, which meant that they also did very well. In addition to the allotment winners that we've mentioned so far, we also did quite well with the garlic. We had a good amount of garlic, and the condition of the bulbs was very good. We also did quite well with the courgettes. And then lastly, we also ended up doing well with the pears. The pears grew so numerous that the branches began to bend under the weight of them. So it was nice to see that we got good fruit despite the challenging temperatures. We've also found that our potatoes did okay from what we could see as well. So that was another winner. And then the brassica bed did reasonably. and we also did pretty well with our blackberries. So all in all, those were some of the winners that we had down at the allotment, and I'm now going to get into some of the allotment losers. So the main allotment loser this year was our melon. Now the reason why was not because of the season, but actually just some of the wildlife that was in the area. So our melons had done pretty well as far as the vines getting established, but then we noticed that one of the vines got broken, and so we thought to ourselves, that's not a big deal, we've got another vine, so let's just wait to see how that one goes. And we started to get some melons growing on it, and we were really excited. And then one day we recall coming to find that the vines were starting to look shriveled up, and we thought that it was due to the hot weather. And when I looked closer, I realized that the vine had been snapped, and the culprits, foxes. Lots and lots of foxes who love to dig up everything and destroy everything. And so we missed out on some melons. So next time we're just going to maybe plant some more and see how it goes in the next season. The other loser we had was the edamame, or the soybeans. And I think it just simply was just too hot, too dry for them to really grow to their potential. So we had to just manage with just the few soybeans we got. And then aside from that, the corn also had challenges, because possibly when we planted them out coincided with significant transition point in the weather. So it meant that the corn bolted really quickly rather than getting a nice strong structure. So it tried to flower too quickly. So it reduced the amounts of corn and also the quality of the corn. Especially because the corn in particular that we were after was the Damone corn, which is bred for cooler European conditions. We weren't to know that we were going to get record-breaking temperatures, and so the corn just responded negatively. Some of the other varieties did a bit better, but unfortunately, yeah, corn was okay, but not as good as it could have been. Then aside from that, another allotment loser we had was onions. In this case, again, foxes got to them. The fox, every day we'd come to the plot and find that the onions had been thrown out of place because the foxes just love to dig them out and scatter them in random places. And then the other thing was that because of the heat as well, despite the watering, we just could not get them to grow to as significant a size. So they really did have a struggle, even though we mulched the ground and everything. So that was another loser, which was quite unfortunate. Within the losers, one thing which I touched on earlier at the beginning of the video when I looked at an overview of the season was the wheat. And the wheat, I would say, was a loser this year. And the main reason, as I alluded to before, was that for some reason when we sowed our wheat out, only half of the plants came up on one side, and so then the other half of the wheat that was sown didn't come up, and the soil was just too dry for them to react or respond to the watering so that they would germinate. And so what ended up happening was that I tried to sow more wheat on that side, and then it resulted in me having more wheat in the side that wasn't doing as well as I had intended, because I think a day after I had decided to do a re-sowing, the wheat that had been there before decided to come up because the rain suddenly come after like maybe a 3-week gap. So it meant that half of the plots where the wheat was grown had some nice strong wheat that came up when it should have, and then the other half had this late coming wheat. And then with just the amount of heat, despite the watering, it was just a nightmare. And so it meant that the one side that came up on time grew to full size, whereas the other half, the wheat plants, didn't reach their full height and attempted to go to seed before they had reached their full maturity. And so what that meant is that it was a reduced yield, reduced quality, but nonetheless we keep on going, and next year we should hopefully do better with the wheat. The raspberries were a bit on and off. So at the height of the season they just didn't like the amount of heat, so it meant that they didn't do as well. But now that things have cooled down, they're starting to bear a bit more, so that's another example of something. And then pumpkins this year did not grow as big. pumpkins are very thirsty plants, and in that heat, unless you're just at the allotment round the clock, it can be difficult to give them what they need, in addition to keeping an eye on the other plants as well. So those were some of the losers, which were unfortunate, but we keep going, and we just hope that for next year we'll be able to get better results. This season we also had some experiments that we did, and the experiments in this case included some different types of beans. So the first type of bean, which was an experiment, was butter bean, and so far these have been growing well, and we haven't yet harvested them yet, but we can see from what we have at the moment that they are doing very, very well. We also tried some navy beans, which are also known as haricot beans, which was the name I forgot to say earlier. And these are the beans which are used for making baked beans. And the experiment was attempted because I had read that in the UK, almost all of the navy beans that we have for our baked beans come from abroad, because they just don't like our conditions in this country. Now I wanted to know whether that was purely on an industrial scale that they didn't do well, or whether they just didn't do well, period. So we attempted these beans in our allotment, and we can say that they did quite well. However, because we had record-breaking weather, I have no idea whether that was just down to the freak weather, or whether actually on a small or household scale they can do quite well in this country. So it was a success, but I think consistency of doing them again next year will show us whether on a small scale they are worthwhile. And then aside from these beans that we also tried, the other experiment was the melon. The melon, as I mentioned, didn't do too well because of the local wildlife. And what I would say for the melon, it was just that we had started it off at the right time, but I think we just needed to have more plants out there to mitigate against damage, because foxes love to destroy vines. There's a scripture in Songs of Solomon which alludes to that fact, and it's interesting that actually getting into the garden showed me that the writer of the Songs of Solomon was very, very clued up on this fact. I had no idea that foxes had an affinity to vines, apart from the scripture, but also seeing it for myself was quite an interesting fact. And then the other thing we also tried, I was given an okra plant quite randomly, so I planted it out. I got one little okra on it. I think I'll try some more next year just to see how that goes. But then the interesting experiment we also did was we grew some Indian flint corn, and this is the type of corn that you would use if you're going to make popcorn, because it actually turns out that you have to have different varieties of corn for different things. So normal sweet corn, which we tend to eat, is known as dent corn, and that is because when the corn's dry they become dented in appearance. Whereas if you want to grow popcorn, you actually have to use what's known as flint corn, and what that means is that the corn is like a hardened round corn which is very solid, almost like a stone. And anybody who's ever popped popcorn knows that they look like this, and so it's actually a specific variety. So in our case it was the Indian flint corn, and it's known by that name because the Native Americans used to grow it specifically for popcorn and also making flour. So that was our experiment. So far the plants seem to be doing okay. We obviously are not going to try and eat them as sweet corn because they don't have the flavour, that's not what they're for. We're just simply going to grow them as popcorn and also maybe try some flour with them as well. And we just have to wait until they dry out fully, because unlike dent corn, you don't just pick them when they are ripe, so to speak. You got to let them dry out really, really good, because you're using them for a different purpose. Towards the end of the season as well, one of our experiments was actually pak choy, and what we did with that was we decided to introduce that pak choy into a bed which had become vacated towards the beginning of the summer, and the bed that was vacated was the garlic, because they harvest early summer. So rather than leave it empty, we decided to plant some pak choy. Unfortunately, it's not done that great. The biggest problems we had were flea beetles, And then once we kind of got over the flea beetle problem a bit, the slugs had them. So we'll keep trying. We'll see how it goes next year. There are some learnings, but I'll get into those as we get on into this video. And hopefully some of those learnings will apply to helping us to do better with the pack dry next year. So the challenges we had this year centered around the heat. So the first example was the pumpkins. Now, despite the watering often, they just didn't attain as much of a size, and the soil in that particular part of the plot, as well as others, would generally feel dry even after heavy irrigation. And so this was a challenge every day at the allotment. The spinach as well had the challenge with that, because the spinach would bolt rather than take appropriate size of the leaves. We also had the challenge with the foxes, which dug up everything, such as the onions, and also destroyed the melons. And then we also had a challenge where the heat meant that the raspberries were struggling because they don't like drought conditions. But now that things have started to cool off, they are now starting to bear more fruit. So those were just some of the challenges, and we will take some learnings from the things we experienced. So the key learnings we can take from our experience this year, we learned about using some mineralized straw as a great mulch and also as a slug deterrent. And the advantage of that is that the mineralized straw we used is excellent because of the fact that it's been mineral treated, so it can last up to 2 years when put down. Another advantage of using the mineralized straw is that it acts as a great mulch, which means that it was able to hold water in the soil without the water drying out. And so the soil was kept moist, which meant that the watering was reduced, which was quite useful in the heat. We also found that another learning we discovered this year was the effectiveness of the granulized diatomaceous earth. And this is basically diatomaceous earth that has been calcium treated, and it is able to be effective even after getting wet because it retains its structure. And so after it dries, if it does get wet, it remains effective against slugs. And so we found that we had great protection against slugs once the diatomaceous earth was put down in granular form. Whereas when we use it in its normal powder form, it tends to just lose its effectiveness the minute it gets wet, so it's only good for one use. So that was another learning that we found, and we found that it was very useful for protecting things such as the lettuce and also for protecting the basil. Thanks for watching. Do remember to like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this video. Take care. Bye.